Blog Talk Radio.
Hi, thanks for joining us on Resilience Radio, where we explore the art and science of thriving in a turbulent world. I'm your host, Dr. Linda Hoops. If you're listening to this show live and have a question or comment, we'd love to have you call in at 347-826-7314. That's 347-826-7314. You can find additional episodes on the web at blogtalkradio.com/resilience-radio. Good afternoon. How many of you have someone in your life who's been diagnosed with a chronic illness? Maybe diabetes or asthma or HIV. Maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody you know. So in a few minutes, we're going to talk to a woman who's not only far exceeded the expectations that were set for her when she was diagnosed with lupus, but she's become a champion, a role model, and a shining light for others living with chronic illness. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is the range of adversity we face. I've developed a model that categorizes adversities in a couple of different ways. Some of them affect us for just a very short time. Somebody maybe cuts us off in traffic and we're disrupted and then we get over it. Some of them take a little longer, a broken bone or going to graduate school. Others last for years, whether it's a chronic illness like this or having a special needs child or some other kinds of challenges that take place over the long term. The other way that we can categorize challenges is in terms of where they come from. So some of them are things that we decide to do ourselves. You know, we may take on an activity that brings challenge to us. There are other challenges that are imposed on us by other people. So we may have a neighbor that's got a really loud dog that really annoys us all the time, and that's a challenge. There are other challenges that are just sort of part of what comes with the world. And chronic illness, for the most part, I think, falls into those categories. We didn't do anything. We didn't pick it. Nobody imposed it on us. It just kind of happened. But what's interesting is that what underlies all of these is similar processes that go on in our brains and our bodies in how we react and respond to adversity. And so many of the lessons that we learn from talking about chronic illness are lessons that are very useful for many of the other kinds of challenges we face. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to introduce Cindy Coney, who I've known for quite a while. She's author of The Wild Woman's Guide to Living with Chronic Illness, and she was diagnosed with lupus in 1980. She's used this as a catalyst to become an ambassador of hope and resiliency. So she speaks, she's an author, she's an expert, she's a role model. We'll talk about the kinds of illnesses that people with lupus and other chronic illnesses face, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Cindy's work. So, Cindy, welcome.
Well, Linda, thank you very much. It's so nice to join you this afternoon. I'm delighted and honored to be a part of your show.
And you are calling from Florida, is that right?
I am. I live in Tampa, Florida. I sure do.
Okay. That's great. That's a beautiful country down there.
It is, and I have to tell you, I'm a native Floridian. There are not too many of us down here. So generations of my family have lived in Florida.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, Cindy, one of the things I'm curious about is I don't actually know a lot about lupus myself. Can you tell me a little bit about what it is and what kinds of challenges it presents to someone who's living with it?
I'll be happy to, Linda. And I'll share a little bit of my story because growing up, I was your very athletic, competitive child. I was the kid in the neighborhood who always wanted to be outside, riding my bike, roller skating. I wasn't the one sitting in front of the television, and went on to do gymnastics and be a cheerleader and all kinds of things. So I led a very, very active life, and I actually married my high school sweetheart. It was the cliche of the cheerleader marries the football player, and almost 38 years later, we're still together and happily married. But I can tell you, when we stood on the altar that night and we vowed to love each other in sickness and in health, I can tell you that we were both standing there envisioning health. We played tennis, we played racquetball, we were athletic, we were highly competitive. As a matter of fact, my mother told me one time, "Don't beat the boys at sports. You'll never get a husband, Cindy." So he and I were married, and were doing all those things. I was running races on the weekends. I'd run a 9-mile race and turn around and run a 3-mile race for fun with some friends, and was extremely athletic. And then something started to happen, and I didn't feel well. And I got tired very easily. And for a long time, everyone thought I had a virus. And some of my lab work became abnormal. Many of my joints started hurting. And I really had trouble getting out of bed in the morning. It was just an effort. I went from being able to run all of these races to really struggling and having to make an effort to get to the mailbox at the end of our driveway. And
wow, did it come on really suddenly, or?
In my case, it was triggered by a virus, I believe. And what they know about many of the autoimmune diseases, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute, is a lot of times there's a genetic predisposition and then an environmental trigger. So for me, I've always believed, although we can't pinpoint it exactly, but I was teaching at the time and caught something from a child and got very, very sick. And it seemed like I never got well. It was like, this is ridiculous. I can't have a virus for years and years and years. And like many of the people who have autoimmune diseases, and especially with lupus, we see that often it takes a long time to diagnose because the symptoms are very varied. One person with lupus may have kidney disease, one person may have joint inflammation, one person may have trouble with their lungs. Lupus can affect multiple and many organs and systems in the body. And what happens with all of the autoimmune diseases and with lupus is you and I, Linda, we all have antibodies, and we make them to fight off illness. When we catch something, when someone sneezes and a cold germ makes its way into our body, we're able to make antibodies and fight that off. It's how we get well much of the time. Well, people with autoimmune disease, for some reason, the antibodies see the body, different systems of the body, as foreign and begin to attack those and cause inflammation. And so it can be the joints, and I had a terrible time with my eyes, lots of inflammation in my eyes, and all of that inflammation causes a great deal of fatigue. And we know
that sounds like it would be particularly hard for someone who has been as athletic as you.
It was incredibly challenging. And we went from doctor to doctor to doctor saying, there's something wrong. Help us figure out what it is so that I can treat it and move on, get over it. And eventually I was diagnosed with lupus. And I have to tell you, I was 27, 28 years old, right around there. And I went to the medical school, and remember, there was no internet at this point. And I went and I opened one of the medical books, and they said the life expectancy of someone with lupus was 5 years. 5 years. I was newly married, early 20s. Even thinking about it today is just, I'm covered in just goosebumps, just because it really was incredibly frightening, incredibly scary, and it was, you don't know what to do with your life. You don't know where to turn. When you were talking about things that come on unexpectedly, I think sometimes those are the most challenging to deal with, because here it is, all of a sudden, I stood on the altar that night with my plan A life in mind. We were going to have children, we were going to work, we were going to, the happily ever after healthy couple with a house full of kids and pets, and, that was the vision I always held for my life. And lupus kind of forced us into a Plan B life where we moved from our old normal to really transition through to a new normal that included lupus as part of that life. And I think that's where the greatest learning occurred for me.
So how did your husband deal with all of this?
You know, it's so interesting, Linda, when you think about how people deal with unexpected adversity, we all handle it very differently. And my husband, he wanted to fix it. He wanted to fix it, chop, yeah, I'm going to fix it. And I tease when I speak to patients. A lot of times, husbands and spouses and significant others are there with them, and I say, okay, I'm going to stereotype, but you guys, I know a lot of times you want to fix things and move on, and that's not the case. With the, like you said, chronic means long lasting, and often there isn't a cure. So we're really treating the symptoms of the disease. And he was angry. I remember him, he would get angry because he couldn't fix it and make it go away. I remember one day he was standing at the end of the bed, and I was so sick. I could not get up. I had horrible headaches and just all kinds of things. And I remember him standing at the end of the bed looking at me and going, "This is not a good day for this. I had other things planned, Cindy." And it's humorous now. But at the time, I was like, wow, I picked today's special, to irritate you. And we had to learn, and I think the first thing we had to learn was to communicate honestly with each other. And we were young, we were unskilled in dealing with life, we were inexperienced. One of the blessings when I look back on my life is my work has always been around resilience. Always. I helped develop programs in drug and violence prevention, and they were always based on resiliency research. So this was understanding personal strengths and building personal strengths and thinking about things we can control and communicating, and all of those things had been a part of my life, but I have to be honest, they had been in my head. Those were things that I knew, that I had read, that I had the knowledge about, but they instantly almost drop to your heart when you face adversity yourself. It's one thing to read about it and to hear about it. And as you know, with all of your work in resiliency, it's very different when it's personal. And it's your challenge that you're working to overcome. It all of a sudden...
Now, I would imagine that... I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, but one of the things I think that is a gift that comes out of that potentially is that you're a lot more credible to people when you're trying to talk to them about resilience and you've been there yourself.
It's interesting, and when you introduced me and said the ambassador of hope, that came from one of the participants in one of the speeches I had given when I spoke, and I agree with you. The fact that I live it, and it isn't that I lived it in the past, I live it day in and day out. But one of the things that I've learned, here's what I say. Cindy has lupus. Lupus doesn't have Cindy. I absolutely refuse to be a victim, and I absolutely refuse to be lupus. I'm not. Lupus is a part of our lives. It's a part of what we deal with, just like people deal with other challenges. And we have to face that, and we have to deal with it. But I get up every morning, and Linda, I can tell you, I choose consciously to be happy. I choose that. It's not always easy. It's not, some days I have to really, really look for the things that make me happy. But they're there. And that's been one of the blessings for me. I don't really take things for granted. I look for those special moments.
That's really important. I think that's true really for any kind of adversity that people are facing is figuring out how to make that choice to be happy in the midst of whatever. So tell me a little bit about how I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm bad about that.
No.
I'm so sorry. I get so excited with what we're talking about. I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so tell me a little bit about how you moved from mastering yourself and, getting yourself sort of in the zone to the point where you've become a speaker and a role model for others. How did you move into that space?
Well, it's interesting. It's like many things in life that we find ourselves doing before we really realize what's happened. When I was no longer doing drug and violence prevention, people started inviting me to their conferences, their patient education conferences, to speak for different groups. And before I knew it, that's what I was out doing. And that's what I love, because there is nothing that makes me any happier than feeling that in some tiny way I have made someone else's journey a little bit easier by sharing the things that I've learned. And I share that when I speak, that I tell them honestly, I'm getting more out of this than you ever will, just by being present to, often it's 300 or 400 people who are in the room and are struggling, and a lot are struggling. They've been newly diagnosed, and it's really, really hard to see beyond the disease at that point. And that's what I bring to the table. I've lived beyond the limits of the disease and continue to do that. I take a lot of medication. I have a lot of health issues, but they're not what I focus on. I really, it's funny, and it seems so trivial and so Pollyanna-ish, but I focus on being happy. And I really believe it's still possible despite challenge and despite illness, whatever the challenge might be. Like I said, some days it's harder than others, but it's worth striving for, because what I see, if you ask me, what do you want for your children, Cindy? I want them to be happy. It's what we want for people we love. It's why I figure it's why we're here. And so I look for those moments that bring me happiness. And so often what happens is we skim over them. There was a little girl walking around our neighborhood the other day, and she was so cute. She had these little blonde pigtails sticking up on either side of her head. She was probably 2 or 3 years old. She has on this little pink dress, these little chubby legs, and she's walking on this sidewalk, and I hear her go, Mommy, stop. I hear my favorite Boydie. I hear it. It's my favorite Boydie, Mom. And it made me smile. And I thought about it for just a minute. That's what we need to focus on. It's being present. I can't, and I have never spent my life focusing on what might happen tomorrow. And I can tell you from a medical perspective, from an emotional perspective, I have always chosen to be healthiest and happiest today, and to live for today without all the fear of the future. I can't worry about that. I can't allow myself to worry about that. And I'll tell you, the greatest tool that I believe we have is self-talk. It's positive self-talk. It's what we say to ourselves when we start getting down,
So can you give me an example?
Oh, yes. It's like I can't say to myself, my life is always going to be bad because I have lupus.
Mm-hmm.
It's always going to be bad because I have lupus. I'm never going to be able to travel because I have lupus. I'm never going to be able to do whatever. I can't do whatever because I have lupus. Here's a can't. I can't allow myself to have that self-talk going in my head. And when it starts, I remind myself that it's not helpful. And I will say over and over and over again to myself, Cindy, not helpful. Cindy, not helpful. Because the stress and the worry just compounds the lupus. So it becomes a vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm. So the if I'm hearing you correctly, you're paying attention and noticing when those I can never do this messages are coming up, and just reminding yourself that it's not helpful, and then replacing it with some other way of thinking about it.
That's exactly correct. That's exactly correct. I reframe it into something else. Let me think about this another way. Let me focus on, and the one thing I do is I focus on what I do want, not what I don't want. Here's what I do want to happen, and even use the language that's positive around that, so that it's not, what I can or don't do. It's what I can do. Let me focus on what I can do. Maybe I can no longer run, but I can walk. I can go walk around my neighborhood. I can enjoy that.
So when we were chatting a little bit before the show, you shared with me a recent trip you'd taken to Switzerland, was it? And so tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, it's the discussion we were having, and I'll share just, was how much I love what I've been blessed to do. I always say that lupus isn't a gift, but the way my life has turned out because of it is a great gift. And I'm one of those people that believes in taking action. So I've been very involved in the lupus community. I actually chaired the Lupus Foundation of America's National Board of Directors and sit on the board, and sat on the board for a long, long time. So that I feel that I'm doing something. And one of the things recently that I was asked to do was to be a patient representative. I think we read so much and we hear so much today about patient-centered care. The Affordable Care Act has a lot of language around patient-centered care, patient engagement. All of those things are part of that. And it's hard sometimes to know what it really means. And one of the things that it meant was a group of researchers from around the world, 50 of them, were getting together in Switzerland, in Zurich, and were meeting to define remission in lupus. Because when we talk about lupus medications, we want to define where it is we want to go. If a patient says, I want to be in remission, what does that mean? And that's not really clear if you think about it, when we think about the difference in cure and remission and those things. So I was invited to attend that meeting as the only patient representative from North America to attend and to bring to the table the patient voice. And what does it mean as a patient to be in remission, and to bring our perspective, the collective patient voice, to the table. And I've been asked to do that a number of times. I've participated with pharmaceutical companies. I actually was invited to testify before the FDA advisory panel to get the drug Benlysta approved for lupus patients, and that's the first drug approved for lupus in 50 years. 50
Wow.
years. And, sometimes we forget what it means to advocate for what we believe in. And it's very empowering to feel that when we're facing a challenge, that we're able to take action and to do something that matters, to turn what was a challenge into an opportunity, which is the way that I've looked at it. My life took a big turn because of being diagnosed with lupus, but the work that I'm doing now, the people that I'm able to meet and speak to is just incredibly fulfilling. And I consider myself incredibly fortunate to be able to do it.
Wow, that's great. So we have a few minutes left here, and there's a couple more questions I have for you. The first one is, one of the things that I think is becoming more clear to me is the importance of managing your energy and making sure you have energy to deal with the challenges. So what are some things that you do that allow you to manage your energy better?
Oh, I am so glad you asked that, because I can tell you that the absolute foundation to my resiliency is rest. And it's giving ourselves permission to rest and to take care of ourselves, because I am much more resilient. I am much more able to handle daily challenges if I have first taken good self-care, if I've first taken care of myself. And a lot of us feel guilty. We feel really guilty doing that. But what I learned, and it was one of the big things that I've learned, is that I want to bring the best Cindy to the world. I want to bring the best Cindy to my family, my husband, my children. When I go to speak, I want the best Cindy to be there. And really, one of those is getting enough sleep and getting enough rest and giving myself permission to do the things I need to do to take care of myself. And, initially it feels a little selfish, but then I realize how much more I have to give.
That's excellent. So the last question I have for you is, so in addition to the advice for good self-care and rest, are there resources that you think people would find particularly helpful? I know you mentioned one thing that's on your website. I'd love to have you share that. But any other places that you would suggest someone go if they're dealing with the challenge that you're facing?
We have to be very careful with diseases that the information is credible. And as I mentioned, I've served on the Lupus Foundation board. I have met with their medical scientific advisory board, and I find their information incredibly credible. It's vetted, it's looked at carefully, and it's super easy to get to and remember because it's lupus.org. And there is just a plethora of information there. And as you mentioned, on my website, and my website is cindyconey.com, one word, CindyConey.com, I have a free ebook. If they go to the bottom of my homepage, you'll see, if you just sign in with your email address, we'll get you the link to download The Power of Personal Resilience, Unleashing Your Unsinkable Spirit, where I talk about a lot of the things I've learned and that I practice to build resiliency.
That's great. Well, I'm really excited about that, about you being able to share that lesson with anybody who's listening, as well as all your wisdom. Thank you so much for being my guest today. I'd like to, again, thank you, and I'd like to invite those of you who are listening to join us next week, where we'll be interviewing Rod Geltz, who started as a cop and ended up as a consultant teaching people about resilience. I've known him for a long time, and I'm looking forward to having him as a guest. So we'll see you next week on Resilience Radio.